We are pushing on in our study of the elder and his character. And we didn't actually get very far into this section last week, so I'm going to quickly review. We only talked about one quality, but let me say this about all of this. As I was working on this week, I said to myself, man, am I ever going to get finished? Because I think it's important to review. It's been my experience in the church that when a congregation is considering asking men to serve as elders, that was generally covered from a sermon. And sermons are fine, but they don't lend themselves as easily to questions and clearing up misunderstandings. So that's why I thought this way would be better. And I want to do a thorough job, but at the same time not get bogged down. So I talked to Jeremy about this yesterday. You guys know the Apostle Paul was a champion of long sentences, right? Writing incredibly long sentences and then sometimes almost seeming to get off track before he came back to what he was saying and all this. So as I'm working through all of these characteristics, I'm like, it's just the same thing with a different word. Yeah. So you may see some overlap, but I don't want to get it to the point where, when we finish all this and it's time to decide where you're sitting there and you're saying, well, brother so-and-so is self-controlled, but he's not really temperate. I don't see it getting down to that level where you're trying to distinguish between the words that precisely. All right, so speaking of temperate, that was the first word, not for any particular reason. The first word in the list, we talked about this one last week. Nephalios is the Greek word. It describes a state of sobriety, and that means like seriousness. It kind of also includes not drunk from alcohol, but also a more serious demeanor. Self-control, particularly in relation to abstaining from excessive wine consumption. It conveys the idea of being clear-minded and vigilant, qualities that are essential for spiritual leadership and maturity. Some other words: self-control, vigilant, sober-minded. And I won't read this whole thing again, but I thought this was important. It describes conduct that is free from any form of excess, not just alcohol. But pretty much anything can be taken to excess. You can go overboard on all sorts of things, and the temperate person would refrain from that. All right, good behavior is the next characteristic. Same, and all of these verses that I'm using for the New King James, your translation may vary a little bit. He's sober-minded, of good behavior. The Greek word there is kosmios, which can mean orderly, respectable, well-behaved. Things that your parents wanted to say about you when you were a kid and they took you places. Other words: well-behaved, decent, orderly, dignified, courteous, or I like the last one, you're unruffled. Okay. Unruffled. Okay. Now, this word is a little bit interesting, though. It had two special uses back in this time. You would see this word kosmios in tributes, if someone was writing a tribute to someone, or in an inscription to the dead. So in other words, if someone was writing your obituary or your eulogy, that might be a place where they would use this word to speak about you. Okay, and of course, our goal is to live in such a way that someone might be inclined to use that word to speak of us. Okay, any thoughts or comments? It's going to be a lot of me talking, I guess, for this, because like I said, it's a lot of information and not a lot of difference sometimes in some of the words. All right. This word is also commonly used to describe the person who is a good citizen. Okay. Those people would win awards in the small towns around here, I guess. Plato said that this describes a citizen who is quiet in the land, who duly fulfills in his place and order the duties which are incumbent upon him as such. Okay. And it describes the person whose life is beautiful. I thought that was a nice way to put it. And in whose character all things are harmoniously integrated. Okay, they got their act together, I guess, would be the vernacular we would use today. They have themselves under control. Any thoughts or questions?
Kind of the picture that we saw in Proverbs, the first 8-9 chapters of Proverbs, that the father and the mother are enjoying, and treating the son to live a life that could be described in this way. If you hold fast to these principles and these bits of wisdom, it talks about your life being a high road and things like that. And I think that fits this picture as well.
Have you ever heard, and that reminds me, have you ever heard the phrase that that person does not seem to be comfortable in their own skin? Yeah, well, I think this kind of implies the opposite of that. They are totally comfortable in their skin, and and they have their life under control. All right, sober-minded. A bishop that must be blameless, sober-minded. Okay, and Titus also included this one in the letter to Titus. Also, sober-minded. The Greek word sophron also means self-control. And again, you see the overlap with the English definitions. Temperate, prudent. That's a word we don't use too often. Also sensible, self-controlled. We've discreet, or a master of himself. Doesn't let himself get ruffled or stirred up about things. Basically, it means of sound mind. Sane, I'm not sure why sane. I don't know if they mean sane as the opposite of insane, but I'm not sure what the reason for that one. In one's senses, and then I like this part, curbing one's desires and impulses. Okay? And that's definitely a quality that all Christians should have, but in particular an elder, because they're going to have to make decisions. We'll talk about this some more when we get to the characteristic of self-willed, not being self-willed. They're going to have to make decisions sometimes that they may not want to make, but it's in the best interest of the congregation or of the particular individual with whom they might be dealing. Okay. And another source that I'm looking at, I decided to include some of theirs, leadership in the local church. They summarize it in this way. An elder must be clearly focused upon his task. His deliberations must be rational rather than emotional. And that's a good point. We start losing control of ourselves and of all kind of emotions, not just anger, but fear or sadness. We can let those control us if we're not careful. He must discern arguments and identify motives of the unscrupulous. He must reasonably foresee the implications of decisions. Okay? And not that he's clairvoyant or anything, but if a person approached an elder that was sort of slovenly in appearance and reeked of alcohol, and the person asked for money, what would be an implication of the decision to give them money? They're going to go continue, right? So that would be giving them money in that case might not be the best thing. Taking them to get something to eat or something like that would be a better foreseeing of what might transpire.
I think that there's tie-in with the not a novice idea well experienced. That's kind of how you gain those discernment abilities. You've been around the block a few times. Kind of
Yeah.
things go.
And then there's nothing wrong with asking questions, right? And a more experienced person, they're not just going to be taken in by, I mean, you can have compassion, but still be, what's a good word? Still be sober-minded, I guess, since that's the word,
Discerning.
Pardon? Discerning, that's a good word. That's a good word. And this is important. He must have resolve in the face of criticism. Is an elder going to get criticized? Big time, right? Because we're all familiar with how often we make everybody happy, no matter what capacity we're serving in. Your job, your family, your neighborhood, whatever, So you're going to get criticism. A flighty, uncertain, reactionary man is unsuited to do the work of an elder. If every bit of criticism is going to make him mad, then he should not seek to do the work. Okay? Thoughts or comments on that?
You can often see somebody in temperate, unfortunately, out in the roadways, but, how does someone react when they're confronted? We were driving down to see my parents on Friday and noticed it was a different set of people driving. It wasn't your everyday work commute, which you can kind of, even though they might drive fast, they're the patterns. I didn't really know who these group of people out the road, but they were just all over the place. Very hostile. Speeding around and reactionary, and that's the type of thing you don't want, as you said, in an elder that's can. So we ought to test them out by taking them down to 285 and see how they act.
Yeah. Okay. All right, gentle. An elder must be gentle. I better look up. I wrote down my epiacase. Epiacase is how you say that. A man who is equitable, fair, or mild, says Mr. Thayer. Some other definition or other ways to translate it: a forbearing disposition, not selfish, patient, lenient. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. Or sweetly reasonable. Okay, that's a nice way to say it. But lenient, that caught my eye when I was reading through these. What do we usually think of when we think of the word lenient?
Grace.
Pardon?
Grace. Grace.
Grace?
Yeah, the first thought in my mind was lax. That a person may be too lax.
Right. Isn't that sort of the primary definition that most people think of when you think, and so I went and looked it up because I'm like, why would you want an elder to be lenient? But I went and looked it up, and sure enough, this is from Merriam-Webster. When it entered English in the mid-1600s, lenient describes something soothing, such as a medication, that relieved pain or stress, or otherwise enabled someone to take it easy. For a brief window of time, it was even used as a noun, referring to any of various ointments and balms that help heal wounds in the long run. Lenient comes from the Latin verb lenire, meaning to soften or soothe, which in turn comes from the adjective lenus, meaning soft or mild. So it does carry a positive, and I think that's what the interpreters meant for it, that chose to interpret as the word lenient, not the lax, because you definitely would not want someone serving that's going to be lax in their decision making, lax in the way that we think of it.
One of the things that judge gets, all judges in all criminal cases, they get a report which tries to identify all mitigating circumstances for the crime as well as aggravating circumstances. So that's the type of thing you need to consider when you're faced with it, is what are the circumstances that brought out this event.
Right. I just saw a news story yesterday about people found I think it was a month-old baby just left out on a median in some town in Colorado, I think it was. Just left out in its baby seat in the median. those of us that are parents and grandparents, I mean, that gets our back up right away, right? And we start thinking of all the terrible punishments that the parents should suffer for doing that to a child. But, you know, again, there could be mitigating circumstances that caused that to happen, not justify it, but at least led to it. And an elder should be willing to consider that sort of thing.
You know, I had to go to traffic court one time, and I was in Gainesville, and I was going down John Morrow Parkway, and I exceeded this. It turns out speed limit's 35 there.
Yeah, that was in my car too. You did that.
I think I was going 51 or something like that. It didn't feel fast, and I wasn't really paying attention to the speedometer upstairs, blue lights, so I got pulled over, and so I decided to throw myself on the leniency of the judge rather than just pay the ticket. And so there in traffic court, I'm first of all, I'm dressed professionally, and not the case for most. And then it was a repeated one after the other person that going up in front of me who had not met their probation, hadn't done their community service, hadn't. And then there was me, and it was like, you have a clean driving record for the past 10 years. Yes, sir. I said, I was going too fast. I understand that. I just wanted to stand before you and say, this is unusual behavior for me, and it was an accident. So he didn't let me off, but he showed some leniency and greatly reduced my ticket costs. And so there's something to be said for that as well, to take a broader view of a situation and occasionally show a little leniency.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot to that soothing too, the kind of person who can calm a situation rather than make it worse.
Yeah. Carol?
I got my very first ticket about two years ago, I guess it was. And I was having to go to Cumming. My first patient was scheduled at 8 o'clock, so I had to leave quite early from our house. And the intersection of Mud Creek and, what's that, 365? I prayed over that intersection every single morning. Just please let me get across so I can go on to work and do my thing. Please clear the way for me, because I don't have real good night vision anyway. Well, I was driving that way in the daytime, and as usual, I prayed over the intersection. No cars. So I went, blue lights behind me. So I pulled over, and I remembered Mark said, don't get out of the car, just stay where you are. So I didn't jump out of the car to ask him what he wanted. But anyway, he came to me, and he said, you ran through a stop sign. And I said, but you don't understand. I said, I prayed over this intersection every single morning. There were no cars. I thought my prayer was answered. And I went on. He looked at me really puzzled. And I said, so, obviously I had to take advantage of no cars. But I'm sorry I didn't stop. So he went back and did whatever they do in the car, and he came back and handed me a piece of paper. And I thought, And he walked back to the car, and I said, excuse me, is this a ticket? Because I've never seen one before. He says, yes, that's a ticket. So he was not lenient.
Did you pray for him?
No.
Back in the 80s, my dad commuted from Duncan Bridge to below Atlanta Fulton County Stadium every day, 6 days a week. And early one morning, he was coming home on 365, same area, and he got pulled over. And the officer came up to him and said, and Dad spoke first. He said, officer, I sure am glad you stopped me. And the officer said, I don't think I've ever had anybody glad I stopped them before. And Dad said, well, I am, because I was asleep. And the officer said, well, I noticed you were leaving and I've been following you for several miles. And the officer, he said, would you like me to follow you home? And Dad said, no, officer. He said, you done scared me away. But there was plenty of leniency. I think that he got the officer to laugh, and that was, kind of changed the circumstance.
And that kind of shows the kind of wisdom that we're talking about with an elder. Yeah, he could have given your dad a ticket, but ultimately the goal in his mind was to make sure driving in general was safe, that travel was safe. And if just pulling him over and asking him that accomplished that, that's that's the point of him being there.
I keep thinking of the proverb, a soft answer turns away wrath. And the other thing is, I think one of the places where you see good leniency and grace and gentleness all combined is when somebody's really emotional and there's a tense situation and you handle it graciously, maybe suffer a few missteps on the part of the other person and how they're talking to you, and just take a larger view, try to help the situation.
Okay. All right. Just. He must be just. Let me find my place here. Diakios suggests a man who is morally upright and fair, impartial, so a little bit of the leniency involved there, and unbiased in his dealings with others. Upright or righteous or uprightness are some other translation. And there's a good, and now this is not, Paul's not using the Greek word in this verse I'm about to show you, but the idea is implied in what I think it is, in what he says in this verse, and that's chapter 5 and verse 21. He said, observe these things without prejudice, doing nothing with partiality. So that's kind of the idea of being just. That's what it would look like or sound like. This summary says, this is a fair and equitable treatment afforded to all. An elder demonstrates a deep sense of right that goes beyond favoritism, popularity, or personal gain. And we've all probably been involved in those situations, especially if we had siblings, where we felt that a person should receive a particular consequence, but they did not, but they received what was good for the circumstance. So an elder needs to be able to do that. Okay. Holy. Hosios suggests a pious and devout individual, and that word is hardly ever translated as anything other than holy. There are a few: devout or saintly, a religious man, or of a holy life, or some of the other. And this is an important, and this is again one that definitely all Christians should strive for, because the scriptures say, you be what? Holy, because I am holy. All right, so it's a goal for all of us. Strong says it conveys a sense of moral purity and devotion to God, emphasizing a life that aligns with divine standards. In the New Testament, Hosios is used to describe both God and those who are faithful to him. So an elder has a genuine desire to live purely and decently. Okay, if he comes across situations that would call that in question, then he would pass on participating in those situations. He does not privately engage in questionable activities that would undermine his respect if others knew of his behavior. So, what is the big the statement that is used to justify so much in our society today? What goes on behind closed doors, right? Or what you do in the privacy of your home is your business. How much does that apply to elders or to Christians in general. Wanda says it doesn't. Anybody? Right? A Christian is, we don't have our Christian suit hanging up there in our closet that we put on this morning before we came, right? And we just leave it there until the next Sunday. That's not the picture we get, right? So, and as we say to our kids sometimes when they're little, if mom and dad aren't there and nobody else is there, who is always there and always watching? God, right? And that's kind of the idea that you have to feel with this level of holy, I think.
Being transparent. We hear that in politics all the time.
Yeah.
But you must be
Yeah, we're still working on that, aren't we?
Matthew is someone that hungers and thirsts after righteousness, and that really kind of brings it down to us in our physical state. I mean, when you're really hungry or hangry and thirsting, you really want something, and that's what we're supposed to desire for the level of intensity for righteousness.
I think, as I agree with that, as a counterpoint though, there is a principle that Paul brings out where you should be mindful of the scruples of other people. And so there may be times where your liberty, you can't be the same person all the time and respect someone's scruples around them without also carrying their scruples over your whole life. And I don't think that that's really what's called for. It's to be aware of what impact your behavior is going to have no matter where you are.
So are you saying, for example, if you were with someone that didn't want to eat the meat sacrificed to the idol, you would refrain while you were with them, but don't feel the need to refrain behind your closed doors?
He says, eat what's in front of you unless somebody says this was sacrificed to idols, and then don't eat for the sake of the conscience of the one who revealed.
Scott, I can say that I think it's kind of rare for someone to have a scruple and they think it's a scruple. They tend to think it's doctrine more often than not. So, and just in the brotherhood, people are all over the map on what is acceptable and not in very different things. Some of us would consider those minor things, some of them major. We're in a congregation where I think most people here celebrate Christmas individually in some form or another. If I were to go visit a congregation that I knew preached against it, I don't think I would show up wearing a Santa suit.
Well, that's fair. That's a fairly good example. Like the boys, we took them trick or treating. We do some Halloween activities, but I know that a lot of people have had problems with it. I don't parade certain things when I think it's just going to cause controversy.
Okay.
My parents did not celebrate Christmas in any way, shape, or form. So we did Thanksgiving with them, and then we did New Year's with them, and tried to keep our kids from saying, "Oh, look what I got for Christmas." Don't tell Grandpa that. We just don't need to get that argument going. So you just to keep peace.
Okay. So there is I don't want to call it wiggle room because that makes it sound like you're trying to get away from something, but there is some leeway, I guess we might say.
I think the difference is you're not talking about questions of conscience here. We're talking about the elder doing that which he knows to be wrong in private and just trying to keep a lid on it. That's not what holiness is.
Yeah.
Scott, I think the thing in the last statement, questionable activities, I mean, you've got the objective questionable activities that are very clear and everyone agrees on in Scripture. But then you have those things that some people would consider different scruples about things. And it is worth talking about whether or not something is truly a questionable activity or a question of scruples? And should a candidate or an elder be criticized for their scruples? Or based on someone else's scruples?
And those are the kind of things I think that are going to have to, first of all, if someone's name is put forward and you have concern, who do you go to? You go to that person, right? You don't even, if you currently have elders, you don't go to them. You go to the person, all right? And you discuss what your concern is to see if you can arrive at an understanding. And then that would be when you would decide, is this a scruple or is this truly doctrine that we're talking about? You know, we just finished a huge one that would blur the line, you know, all the study we just did about drinking, okay? I mean, if there's a passage in the Bible that says do this or don't do this, and you don't do it or you do it, then it is a sin. I mean, if you have a command, either do it or not do it, and you choose the opposite action, that's a sin. Okay, and those are clear. You know, as we pointed out in our long study of wine, what is the sinful part? Drunkenness, right? That's the sinful part. Okay, and so lots of folks will still have that, you know, leading up to that point of drunkenness, they'll have differing views on whether that's acceptable or not, and whether it would undermine their respect for somebody or not. Yes.
God, I think the most important thing is it says God is love, that an elder or anyone working in the church needs to love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, mind, and soul, and love his word. And if there's an issue that needs to be addressed, he needs to be prayerful about it. The first thing when he hears something, even before the investigation starts, I think needs to be on his knees in prayer, praying about the situation, praying for the individual, praying for the church, and praying for himself, or whoever's going to have to address it, and needs to arm himself. What did Jesus fight Satan with? The Word of God. Needs to arm himself. And I think when he approaches that individual, it would be wonderful if it was done as a Bible study. Well, let's reason together. Let's look at God's Word. Let's study this. Let's see what the Scripture says about it. Instead of him saying, this is the path we need to take, let the Bible, let the Scripture direct that path.
Okay. I don't disagree. And finally, in holiness, he truly seeks things, and that kind of summarizes what you just said, that are beneficial, godly, and of impeccable reputation. Okay. All right, self-controlled is the last one, and this will that'll be good timing. This one is kind of one of the more important ones, I think. I mean, they're all important, but this one kind of has some additional consideration. Enkrates is the Greek word, suggests a self-disciplined man. Some other ways, again, temperate. So you see what I meant? Some of these are kind of overlapping. Discipline, abstemious. When's the last time you used that in a sentence, right? Abstemious. Maybe in the New York Times crossword puzzle or something like that. Okay. Mr. Strong said it denotes the ability to master one's desires and impulses, particularly in the context of moral and ethical behavior. In the New Testament, it is often associated with the fruit of the Spirit and the virtues expected of believers. No, I'm thinking of self-willed, not self-control. Never mind. So there is evidence that a man acts with deliberation and control rather than impulsively and haphazardly. Okay, so he's not just, as Julie just said, anything that the elder deals with should definitely be approached with prayer, right? Prayer and study, not just a knee-jerk reaction to whatever it is. You know, might an elder hear some pretty shocking things from a member of the congregation sometime? Yeah, okay. And they've got to have that level of maturity that Jeremy mentioned earlier to control their reaction to what it is that they hear. Because I can guarantee if you have an over-the-top sort of reaction, you're just probably going to make the situation worse. You know, especially if the person worked through enough in their own mind to be able to come and share that with you, you know, then that over-the-top reaction would be the last thing that they would need to see or hear. Because you're kind of going to shut them down if you do that. A man who is financially undisciplined, who engages in questionable entertainment practices, who speaks recklessly and injuriously, even in the absence of hostility, is not self-control. Okay, we would call that person a lout, I guess. All right, self-willed was the one I was thinking.
Can I make a comment about that?
Sure.
I've been reading several books to finish out the year on habits, and a lot of people have read Atomic Habits, but there's other good books on that as well. Tiny Habits is really good, and The Power of Habits, kind of a famous one. You know, in The Power of Habit, he talks about the idea that the reason we have habits in the first place is because the brain does not want to be ground down in every minute decision. And so it quickly develops habits in parts of the brain that are, you know, it kind of builds it into the, I'm losing the terms, but, and so you don't really have to think about the fact that you might put your left shoe on first versus your right, or you don't have to think, and it frees your mind up for more important considerations. And so I was reminded of that this morning as I continually, because I don't have power still, as far as I know, I continually walked into darkened rooms and flipped the light switch on. And I was irritated by that every time, but I had to remind myself, well, this is just because your brain has developed this habit, and it's not anything to get irritated about. It's just something to take a chuckle over. But I think that I used to think of self-control as this sort of like white-knuckled sort of, but I think, and the Proverbs study helped me with this as well, a self-controlled man is a person who has developed the systems and habits of life that enable him to function in a particularly good way. And he's not constantly having to make decisions about whether he should or should not do something, because he has built it into his life that this is the way I behave, these are the things I do, these are the words I say, and it becomes almost motor memory to a certain extent. And I think that's what the Father is trying to entreat the Son to build in his own life for a successful life there in the book of Proverbs. And I think it's also why Paul is comfortable saying things like, imitate me as I imitate Christ. Look at the habits that I've developed as into my life of self-control, and emulate them for yourself so that you can continue to walk a less burdened life and make fewer decisions about. Anyway, I think I made my point.
Okay.
I was going to repeat myself. I didn't want to do that.
All right. And that's, if you keep going, you're going to preach my sermon today, so we'll cut you off right there. And I'll mention some of those points in the lesson. All right, and then the last one is self-willed. Okay. Orthodox suggests a man who is self-pleasing, self-willed, or arrogant. Okay, and an elder should not be those things. Some other translations: overbearing, obstinately self-willed. Not be bossy, that's from a more modern translation. Over fond of having his own way. Okay? Mr. Trench from Synonyms of the New Testament, the man thus obstinately maintaining his own opinion or asserting his own rights is reckless of the rights, feelings, and interests of others. And we've mentioned quite a bit scruples and things that are not mattering of doctrine. This would be an example where an elder has to be careful, right? Not demanding that his opinion is the only correct approach to something. And Peter addressed that, nor as being lords over those entrusted to you, but being examples to the flock. If it's not a matter of doctrine, an elder has no business saying, do it this way because I say to do it. Okay? You don't understand the eldership if that's a statement that you would make. Another person said an overbearing disposition comes from arrogance or insecurity, resulting in a domineering, despotic manner of leadership which crushes the spirit and extinguishes the gifts and abilities of others. Leadership by control quickly divides a group into factions and arguments, taking away the spirit of unity and cooperation. Has anybody ever worked for a person like that? Yeah, they're no fun to work with. I heard horror stories about principals at other schools that, elementary teachers you got to have your bulletin boards done, right? And got to have things. But I heard of principals that would come in and adjust things on your bulletin board in your classroom, okay? An exact picture of that kind of person right there. Okay. Clearly, the person who's orthodox is an unpleasant character. People like that are intolerant, condemning everything that they cannot understand, and thinking that there is no way of doing anything except their way. Such a quality, as W. Locke said in his commentary, is fatal to the rule of free men. No one who shows contemptuous and arrogant intolerance is fit to be an office bearer of the church. So, there's a delicate balance between advising in matters of wisdom and imposing one's personal views upon others. Okay, again, and we're not talking about matters of doctrine there. When an elder sees danger or drifting, he may be overcome with zeal for what is right and respond with a heavy hand. Okay? And that's why the good parent quality is so important, right? Because you run into that in parenting all the time. An older elder may preempt a younger one, thinking that such an inexperienced man cannot be as wise as he is. An elder must distinguish between truly leading the sheep in the right way and trying to drive them forcefully by personal will. Okay? The goad that I talked about a couple weeks ago, it was not intended to hurt, right? It was intended to guide. We need the elder that knows how to use it as a guide rather than jabbing it into the sheep and causing pain.